Any questions, comments, concerns before we get going and specifically talking about the joys of the digestive system? Nope. All right. Okay. So without further ado, what we're really going to go through is all the different components of the digestive system. We're going to talk about the physiology behind how each area of this is going to function, as well as the chemistry of how we're going to be breaking things down, thanks to utilizing obviously enzymes and pH, a couple other things as far as modifications that are happening as we go through the digestive tract. Of how we're going to get into the most basic molecules, our amino acids, glucose, free fatty acids, and then how we're going to go ahead and pass that around the body. So the first wonderful stop when it comes to digestion is going to be we chew up the food. We have it mixed a little bit with our saliva, which has both amylases, that's the class of enzyme that breaks down carbohydrates, as well as we are going to be utilizing some lipases that are going to be breaking down fatty acids. We'll get a little bit more into that. So we go in through the wonderful mouth, chew, chew, swallow. We go down the esophagus. First major flaw of the human body, the air hole and the food hole is the same hole for a little bit up there. So choking is something that can happen. Once we get to the stomach, hopefully our esophageal sphincter does a good job so we don't have any GERD, but we're going to touch on that. We then are going to have the food kind of mix and break down a little bit more into the stomach until it's essentially broken down into what's known as enough chyme that it will then go into the duodenum. The pH comes up pretty quickly there, along with a whole lot of different enzymes that are going to help with breaking down all of our macronutrients. And then we're picking up nearly all of our nutrients through our small intestine, going in initially into the jejunum and then into the ileum, which I know are a lot of fun when it comes to each of those names. And then we get ourselves into the large intestine, which effectively is mostly going to be in charge of removing water essentially from the foods that we ate. And it's going to also be picking up a little bit of vitamins and minerals. So for the one of you guys that had the good question over what happens to folks that unfortunately have to have part of their colon resected, well, you aren't able to take up all of those fluids. Because if we can see here, guys, you produce a lot of fluid in all the different regions of our GI every single day. The key is our colon is what takes it back up. So part of what's happening whenever you've got diarrhea is effectively our large intestine is not doing its job so that it's not taking up the fluid because it's probably trying to remove what it thinks is some type of poison. So this can be due to obviously food poisoning itself, the stomach flu, which is more of a viral effect. And obviously you can make other mistakes with taking in certain chemicals you shouldn't. The ileocecal valve, that's between the ileum, so the end of the small intestine, and the cecum, which is the beginning of your colon, in case you guys are wondering. So first thing we do, we hopefully chew our food, which effectively is going to break it down so it's in smaller sizes, which make it easier for enzymes and otherwise to work on it, which by doing that increases that surface area. So now, once again, we can have a greater amount of that food that's being essentially affected upon for breaking it down to its simple things, as well as it's going to be mixing it with saliva and the digestive enzymes inside of it. So that's helping with break it down along with keeping it in solution. So I'm sure some of you guys have made the mistake of eating too many saltines all at once to see what happens and definitely ran or got to ride the struggle bus thereafter. So obviously things that happen to be higher in fiber, we need to make sure we chew it more so that we break those cell walls because we enzymatically have no way to break down a cell wall inside the body. And if you have questions over what I mean, just think about the last time you ate a lot of corn and you obviously did not do a good enough job of chewing that corn. Now, we're going to have 3 pairs of these salivary glands, pardon me, our parotid, sublingual, and submandibular glands. And that was the picture earlier. Now, the esophagus itself is what's going to go ahead and transport the food down into the stomach. And this is going to do so once we go ahead and swallow. Now, this is essentially a rhythmic contraction. So essentially, the muscles at the top of our esophagus contract, then the one slightly below that contract, and slightly below that contract, slowly below that contract. So we end up with this peristalsis, this wave of contraction that is in turn going to squeeze the food down into the stomach. So notice we can do this even when we happen to be upside down. I'm sure some of you guys are vaguely familiar with this recreationally, because what do some folks do on occasion when it comes to ingesting beverages when upside down? What do we typically refer to that as?
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Taylor. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So once we get there, now we are into the joys of the stomach. Okay. Now it's going to be about maybe a foot long, and some folks obviously a little bit smaller, depends on your body size. We've got the corpus, which is going to be a little bit more towards the bottom, the body of it, the antrum, and then the fundus. So at one end, we have what's known as the pyloric sphincter. This is literally the sphincter between our duodenum and our stomach. Now, this is really important because this is where we're going to store food and we're going to start to break it down. This is where we're getting all of our gastric secretions, specifically the hydrochloride that's coming, dropping the pH, and pepsin, which is going to be the major enzyme for breaking down proteins from being very complex into shorter segments. And we're going to have a lot more chymotrypsin, trypsinogens, other protein class enzymes that are going to be coming from the pancreas that we're getting through the sphincter of Oddi in the duodenum. So it's going to allow this to not empty too quickly because it's really, really acidic inside of your stomach. And so we get bicarbonate that's also being released by your pancreas to help bring that pH up quickly, because the stomach is well suited to deal with very low pHs. It essentially regenerates, has a mucosal layer, and otherwise to tolerate this. You don't have the same type of situation when we happen to be getting into the duodenum. So we're going to be regulating this through a number of different feedback pathways and otherwise that we're going to get into a little bit, along with obviously how we're going to break down each of our macronutrients. So when it comes to, this is the fundus at the top, okay, we can see that body in general, we can see the antrum down low. And notice, guys, where we're having the mucus to protect the inside of the stomach, pepsinogen, which is the precursor to the enzyme pepsin. When it's exposed to high amounts of hydrochloric acid from the body, that's when we're now going to go ahead and have that activation of pepsinogen into pepsin. So what's going to get us to empty our stomach effectively is going to be a number of different feedback loops. So the feed forward is we literally have a much more distended stomach. And we're talking about up to 6 liters for some folks, depending on how big they are. What's really funny is the research on folks that are competitive eaters is the ones that have advantage are typically individuals that have a narrower waist in the first place and a lower amount of adiposity because they've got a greater ability to essentially expand from the eating. Now, when we have, notice, a great amount of any of our macronutrients, so just energy in general, we're slowing down the emptying of the stomach, as well as high osmolarity is going to slow it down, and then high particle size, meaning we did not chew our food that well. And as well, the osmolarity is going to be essentially greater amounts of our different types of electrolytes for the most part. Now, what's interesting is through essentially this, between the antrum and the body, we're going to have a contraction that's going to occur in the stomach, and then the antrum itself will contract. And when that contracts, let me put my hand so you can see it, it's going to retro pulse essentially the food inside the stomach, which is turning it over. So sometimes I'm sure you guys have heard your stomach growling. Otherwise, part of it is going to be that mechanical action, especially if there's nothing in there but a bunch of air. So the muscle tone itself is going to obviously decrease, so it allows it to stretch out. We're going to have those glands that are going to secrete the digestive juices and specifically hydrochloride. And it's going to obviously be able to contract and relax. So that's literally allowing, once again, that food now to keep mixing into the form we refer to as chyme, where now we're going to be able to do a better job taking up. Now, we don't absorb any macronutrients inside of the stomach, except we get a little bit of water. Now there is one, it's not a macronutrient in, let's say, normal healthy diets, but there is actually one type of calorie containing chemical that you can ingest that you do absorb through your stomach. Do any of you guys know what that is?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, no worries. You do not absorb carbs, protein, or fat really through the stomach, but there's another nutrient that has calories that it does actually get absorbed through the lining of your stomach.
it anonymous?
Nope.
Is it alcohol?
It is alcohol, Celia. And that's why when they talk about people drinking on an empty stomach and obviously it hitting them much harder, much faster, that's because you actually absorb it through your intestinal lining. Or sorry, through your stomach lining as well as your intestinal lining. So we're trying to control the rate of which we're going to be digesting these foods. A big component of it is our parasympathetic nervous system, aka the rest and digest component. That's going to allow us to stimulate motility of having food move through a digestive tract like we're supposed to. Okay. This is in turn going to be overruled by our intrinsic regulation. Okay. So this is going to be different hormones that are going to function, as well as you can actually burst your stomach. Pretty rare. You can also burst your bladder. Yeah, you would think that, but it depends on if they're that deconditioned, and specifically the smooth musculature around the stomach happens to be that weak that it can't effectively hold out. It's exceedingly rare, but human bodies are weird. You can do crazy things if you're not being safe. Yeah. So depending on what we're actually digesting, okay, we're going to see different types of hormones being released that in turn are going to affect not just the secretion of different enzymes and otherwise to help with digestion, but also the speed at which the food is going to be moving through our digestive tract. So we are essentially starting the digestion clock from the second you ingest the food, and can take up to 4 to 6 hours for that food to effectively pass all the way through the end of your ileum. Now, we have specific enzymes for specific actions that we go through. If we can't digest it, it's going to be fermented by bacteria or it's going to be expelled. So fermented is going to be fiber, and we're going to touch on that in a bit. And then as far as expelled, well, I'm sure you guys have seen certain foods the second time. That's when you know you didn't break it down. Now, we're producing a lot of it, but we are going to be reabsorbing this specifically in the large intestine for the most part. So we talked about some of these hormones previously. So gastrin, which can be released by that stomach, is telling us to produce more hydrochloride, as well as releasing more pepsinogen to help with breaking down protein. We then have our small intestine-based hormones of secretin, cholecystokinin, and gastric inhibitory peptide. So if we've got a lot of food there, we're actually going to be essentially slowing things down a little bit. With CCK, we're going to be releasing the enzymes to help with digestion, but slowing it down so once again, it's not passing through us too quickly. And secretin is incredibly important because that's going to be released thanks to effectively the signal of the lower pH chime that's coming from the stomach getting into the duodenum. And then finally, we've got glucagon-like peptide and guanylin. Both are going to be important for slowing things down, specifically guanylin when it comes to removing both water and salt from our feces, which once again is a very important hormone when it comes to avoiding things like diarrhea, which is actually one of the more lethal maladies that do happen to humans on a semi-frequent basis, depending on where they're at in the world and access to appropriate care. So once we left the stomach, now we're into the small intestine, which is going to be somewhere in the neck of, say, 6 to a little over 10 feet. And notice we're only talking about an inch to 2 inches in diameter. Now, the first and shortest segment is going to be the duodenum, followed by the jejunum and the ileum. Both are going to be probably at least a full meter each. Now, most of our absorption is actually taking place in the first two components between the duodenum and the jejunum, and more specifically the jejunum than the duodenum. If these words seem a little difficult and funny, it's okay. I'm going to be using a lot. Now, we have a lot of folds inside, which are known as Kirkering, which are literally by having those folds, we naturally increase the surface area massively. And then from there, we're going to see that when we get down to the little intestinal wall itself, we have what's known as villi. And these little small finger-like projectiles in turn are going to increase that surface area even more so. So instead of having kind of like our lungs with having the alveoli, which is going to massively increase the total amount of surface area of our lung, we have the same thing only through all of these folds, through the villi, the microvilli, and obviously the Kerckering inside of our small intestine. So what we have here is a list of all of the enzymes that are going to be allowing us to go ahead and go through with the digestion that we are trying to have folks obviously break down different components. So notice with our general salivary amylase, it's going to be breaking down complex carbohydrates into just basic maltose, which is a disaccharide. Same thing with our pancreatic amylase, which is once again breaking things down into essentially shorter carbohydrates. And notice they all work within optimum pH rate ranges. Now, maltase, sucrase, and lactase, these are all going to literally be on those cells that happen to be lining the inside of our small intestine. And they are going to be breaking down those disaccharides into monosaccharides. Now, with lipids, we've got that lingual lipase that's going to be breaking down. I like how this is actually a mistake. It should say triglyceride into fatty acids, but I enjoy the fact there's literally a misspelling in your book. So even people with PhDs make mistakes. Go figure, guys. And then our pancreatic lipase, which is also going to be important with breaking down triglycerides. And we'll learn about the importance of bile and how it's going to help emulsify those fatty acids in smaller micelles in a little bit from the liver. Now, the first enzyme that's actually allowing our body to break down protein is actually going to be pepsin, which is being produced inside of our stomach, which is taking those complex, massive proteins into basic polypeptides. So we're talking about, 10, 20, maybe even 100 amino acids in a row. This is where trypsin, chymotrypsin, and carboxypeptidase and elastase are all going to come in to function that are being produced inside of the pancreas and released in the duodenum through that wonderful sphincter of Oddi. And that's going to break down these polypeptides into individual amino acids, dipeptides, so 2 amino acids, and tripeptides, meaning 3 amino acids. Take a look at the pH range that pepsin works within, and then see how high the pH range is for all of our pancreatic enzymes, because this is from the duodenum where we've got a lot of bicarbonate that's also coming from the pancreas. And whereas we've got the low pH thanks to the acidic environment of the stomach with activating pepsinogen into pepsin. Now, the gallbladder, though not a completely necessary gland for life, I'm sure you guys know somebody that's had one removed, this is going to be useful for actually storage of what is known as bile and then concentrating it. Bile is important when it comes to breaking down and absorbing fat, because as that's released, it's in turn going to cause those fatty acids to effectively be broken down into what are going to be smaller organizational packets, because fats, as you guys remember, are hydrophobic. And since they're afraid of water, so to speak, they're going to naturally form balls. And when we have the bile salts, it's going to allow them to be in smaller micelles, which are much easier to go ahead and absorb through those cells on the brush border on the inside of the small intestine. Now, pancreas itself is going to be just behind your stomach. It is a massive organ that is important not just for blood sugar regulation, but for digestion. So I've already talked about the fact that it's releasing effectively, literally baking soda, sodium bicarbonate, not an allusion to cocaine. I guess your generation is now using baking soda and calling it Coke. Fair enough, whatever. And this is important for essentially buffering out that pH. And then notice the digestive enzymes themselves that are coming from the pancreas. That's incredibly important for breaking things down. Now, this is going to be, as far as the amount, heavily related to the type and amount of food that the person is ingesting. So the body is able to sense to a certain degree, effectively, the amount of protein, fat, and or carbohydrate in those meals they've eaten. Now, our last stop before the toilet bowl is going to be that large intestine. Now, this itself is going to be somewhere in the neck of 4.5 feet, obviously scaling upwards and downwards depending on the size of the person we're working with. And this is going to involve the colon, the rectum, and anal canal. I'm sure you guys know what each of those are. And the colon itself is going to be the ascending. So that's the first part that's coming up, the transverse, the descending, and then the sigmoid colon. Okay. We're really doing most of the work effectively as far as reabsorbing fluid initially. And if we're not getting enough fluid in general, That's where we're going to have really dry, uncomfortable stools. It's typically going to be something that can cause constipation. And at this point, we're really starting to switch that chime over to where now it's the form that we're used to, is dropping off into the toilet bowl. So we're really focusing on reabsorbing all of the water and electrolytes we put into those digestive juices, as well as holding things on until we are at an appropriate time to evacuate. So our ileum, so the end of our small intestine, we've got that ileocecal valve, your appendix over here, which I know is a little SOB that can burst on people, but it is useful because your colon actually has the highest amount of bacteria inside of it compared to all of the rest of your digestive tract. Your mouth, your stomach, and everything else, obviously nothing has as many bacteria, and bacteria isn't a bad thing. Microbiome is going to be very important for fermenting all of those types of carbohydrates we can't break down, specifically thinking about fiber, where then we're going to get sometimes vitamins from them, such as vitamin K, as well as we're going to be able to absorb things like short chain fatty acids that have been fermented, which also are going to be useful for health. So what we have here, guys, is a basic understanding of that osmolality. So if you remember that back in your chemistry, so if we have a semi-permeable membrane, something with effectively a low osmolarity, something with a high osmolarity, it's going to naturally pull fluid towards it. And so our water that we drink tends to have relatively low osmolarity, whereas if we're going to look at things like blood or gastric fluid and sweat, it's naturally going to be much higher. And that's where when we're using certain types of electrolyte beverages to help replenish ourselves, it's actually going to slow down the gastric emptying if those levels happen to be too high. So that's what we're going to learn later on, even more so when we talk about fluid regulation. We want to be mindful of effectively how we're going to be influencing our body's ability to essentially absorb those fluids more rapidly, depending on, once again, osmolarity, calorie content of the food we happen to be, or beverage we're happen to be absorbing. So the intestinal cells themselves that are forming that border of the villi are then having, that's what we call the brush border. So that's essentially the layer of the inside of your body between all of the food passing through your body. Now, we then have those microvilli, which notice we're talking nanometers, but by having villi, which are naturally going to have increased surface area along with the Kirksing, as well as we have the microvilli. So this is causing us to have a massive increase in the total surface area. So thanks to all of this, we are going to have literally about 600x the amount of space to absorb nutrients compared to if our GI was simply like a garden hose. It was just a smooth tube, the same total difference. So if you were to actually take the total amount of surface area of the small intestine for an individual and lay it out, iron it completely flat, it would obviously be incredibly thin, but it would literally be an area larger than your typical tennis court. So when we talk about those villi, guys, and the microvilli, well, here's the villi itself. So then whenever you essentially examine it even tighter, you're going to see essentially these microvilli. So the microvilli, the villi, and then here is those Kirk-ring folds that we're going to find on the inside. And because we've massively increased that surface area, it gives us a lot more opportunity to absorb that food. And so we're going to talk about how we're going to absorb all of our macronutrients, water, and our micronutrients, specifically our vitamins and minerals. So most food is going to pass through you in somewhere in the neck of 12 to maybe 60 hours. When in doubt, guys, check the toilet bowl. Just eat a meal of a lot of corn and don't chew that well, and you'll get an idea of how fast it goes through. So the time it's actually going through our actual intestinal tract is typically, going to be somewhere in the neck of 3 to 10 hours. Now, the small intestine itself is going to have an outer layer of that smooth muscle that's going to allow for peristaltic waves, so that we're going to have not just moving the food down, but also we're going to mix it back and forth, which is going to allow us to break down that food even more so, as well as get more of the food to essentially move itself over all of those microvilli. So we're going to do a better job of absorbing those nutrients. Your GI is pretty good at absorbing all the calories you put in, much to some people's chagrin. The key is, like anything else, there are situations where it's not going to be as good. And there's certain types of foods the body's not as efficient with digesting. So when it comes to breaking down carbohydrates, where the first stop is going to happen with breaking down carbohydrates inside of our mouth through alpha amylase, which is going to be breaking down larger glucose polymers into the disaccharide of maltose. Now, once we get into the actual stomach, we have effectively neutralized that enzyme because the pH is too low. We literally digest that enzyme. Now, in the duodenum, we're going to bring that pH back up thanks to the bicarbonate, and that's where we're going to have more alpha amylases from the pancreatic juice. That's going to be breaking it down into simple disaccharides, as well as we are going to have, remember, those disaccharides enzymes. So this is where lactase comes in place, because that is the typical enzyme that a number of folks lose from their GI as they get older, hence lactose intolerance, because you literally can't break down lactose anymore. This is a normal thing that happens. It turns out it's really weird to think about somebody my age, or even somebody your age, still trying to nurse on your mother. So fiber is, remember, another class of carbohydrate. But what's interesting is carbohydrate, or fiber, is going to be essentially a type of carbohydrate with a different type of linkage between one carbohydrate molecule and the next. So alpha 1,4 and alpha 1,6 linkages is what you typically find in glycogen, and that's what our body has enzymes to break down. Whereas we can't break down beta 1,4 and beta 1,6 linkages. It's just the key doesn't fit the lock. And so because of this, we are going to pass some fiber, obviously, in our feces. However, a lot of it is going to be being fermented by bacteria inside of our body. Now, this is going to produce, obviously, some gas. Now, what's also interesting, it's going to be producing fatty acids that we're going to be utilizing as actually an energy source inside of our body. And this, in turn, is going to be useful also for giving us a certain amount of fecal bulk, meaning it has enough formed elements when it goes through us. Okay, so see here, guys, when we have an alpha 1,6 linkage, we actually have a branching in carbohydrates. When we have an alpha 1,4, this is when they're daisy chained together. So you can see how the enzyme sucrase is going to break one sucrose into a glucose and a fructose molecule, and so on. Now, we have on the right that's very important to understand is how we're actually going to go ahead and get that glucose into the body, and galactose, because that is another carbohydrate that we're getting specifically as a carbohydrate as part of milk sugar, is we use sodium as a symporter. This is another reason why sodium is put in beverages like Gatorade and Powerade, because it's not just important to replenish the glycogen you've lost, but as well as it's going to be important to utilize sodium to actually help getting that glucose into your body. Now, glucose transporters are going to be, there's essentially their number. So GLUT2 is important from the epithelial cells, so that's the brush border into capillary, the blood supply from our GI, getting it then to travel through the body. Now, GLUT5 is going to be important for getting fructose, which is a different type of sugar. And this specifically is going to be one that's coming from our sucrose, along with, we're going to see this a lot as kind of fruit sugar. And this is going to use a different transporter. So since we're using two separate types of transporters, guys, it's important when we think back to receptors and their sensitivity, their number, or just enzyme number. When we think back to exercise phys, this is going to be the limit on how quickly you can replenish glucose levels, and specifically glycogen post-workout, because we can literally saturate out those glucose transporters. We just can't go any faster. And that typically tends to be about 50 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour, changes relative to body size, and we'll get there later. But we have, since in an own class, when it comes to fructose and letting that go and be absorbed in the body, we can now increase the total amount of carbohydrates, because this fructose will be converted into glucose in your liver and then put back into the blood supply of about 30 extra grams. So that's why utilizing a carbohydrate beverage when we happen to be doing longer, like hard volume training, this, or competing, could be something like a triathlon, marathon, or otherwise, it is important to actually utilize a certain amount of sucrose, so that way we can get in not just glucose and fructose and get a total greater amount of carbohydrates in our body per hour. Does anyone have questions? Does that make sense? I realize I've been talking to myself for a while. Thank you, Paige. So now let's talk about the joys of breaking down protein. Now, remember, this is going to happen in the stomach, initially with pepsin, and then small intestine when we're getting into more specific enzymes, which we're going to touch on in a moment. Now, the parietal cells is what's going to go ahead and produce and secrete the hydrochloric acid. That's going to be dropping our pH when we get into the stomach. And with that low pH, we're going to now be able to unravel proteins, because it turns out most proteins in the body are meant to work within certain pH ranges. So when they unravel, now those spots become open, that pepsin can get in there and do its job and start to break it down. Now, from there, we're going to break them down even further inside of the duodenum and in the jejunum into those simple amino acids, dipeptides, and tripeptides, which are going to then be essentially absorbed through, once again, our intestinal layer. So pepsin itself is going to take that giant protein and break it down into, oligopeptides and otherwise, which are then going to be acted upon. So you see how the shapes are different. So it'd be different amino acids as we're going through. So thanks to the trypsin, chymotrypsin, carbopeptidase from our pancreas, we're going to break these down even further. And notice on the brush border of these cells, we literally have different transporters that allow these peptides into the cell. And then we have enzymes inside of those cells to break them down into their basic amino acids and have them go through the bloodstream. Now, notice for the dipeptide and tripeptides, they're going to have specific transporters where they can get quickly into the bloodstream and do their job after they're broken down their individual constituents. But once again, you see the importance of sodium when it comes to the turnover and the absorption of amino acids, as well as see how we're having to use energy, as well as cycle this back. Same thing we saw with carbohydrate. That's why when we talked about bomb calorimetry, we get actually more calories from lighting the fluid on fire than what we get from absorbing it, because we're not 100% efficient. We have to use a certain amount of energy to literally digest and take food in our body. So we then have fats. Lipase is going to break this down into those triglycerides and free fatty acids. Once we get into the stomach, we are going to get a little bit more work, because it turns out that enzyme is going to be a little bit more resistant to breaking down, whereas we're really getting this digestion done in the small intestine from the 1-2 punch of the bile secretion, which is going to emulsify the fat into smaller globules, so we have that higher surface area, as well as the pancreatic lipase that's going to break them down essentially from the triglycerides into glycerol and fatty acids. So we have this fat droplet that is going to literally be how it forms inside of the chyme. This in turn is going to be emulsified from the bile acids, which in turn is going to turn this into a much smaller droplet. So it's going to form essentially this micelle, and that's what's going to be actually absorbed into the brush border. So this is going to occur with every single nutrient by either active transport or simple diffusion. Active transport means we're having to use ATP because we're working typically against a gradient that we are trying to essentially get a greater amount inside of our body than we already have, which is higher than the food of what we naturally ate. Now, diffusion is just going to go simply through the membranes based upon the concentration gradient. So this is where water obviously is going to live for the most part, as well as alcohol, hence the absorption as it's going through your stomach. Now, remember, guys, simple diffusion doesn't require energy, whereas active transport is going to require energy, and specifically a transporter channel where it's going to allow it to go through that double phospholipid bilayer. So our basic carbohydrates, guys, remember again, are going to be brought in thanks to the monosodium saccharide, sodium monosaccharide co-transporter, where we're using a sodium to go in with the glucose into the cell. And this also can be utilized by galactose. Now, what we mean is we need to use sodium to go ahead and move this through, and we're going to use energy to work on the sodium potassium ATPase pump to get that sodium back out to turn it back over again. So once again, using energy. Whereas we don't need to utilize sodium and can use diffusion through essentially the GLUT5 transporter specifically for fructose, and GLUT2 transporters specifically are going to move those individual carbohydrates, typically we're talking glucose, from that cell into the capillary, so it's in the bloodstream. Now, fats are going to once again be broken down into individual fatty acids in those micelles, which means that smaller packet. From there, it's going to be brought into the cell where they're going to be reesterified in triglycerides, so the glycerol with the fatty acids. And once we get into that form, it's going to be incorporated with, notice, both cholesterol and phospholipids to form what's known as chylomicrons. These are larger molecules that in turn are going to be put back into transport specifically through our lymphatic system, which there it's going to hit our subclavian veins. And really we're talking about those packets are going to be essentially packaged eventually by our liver. And now we're talking about not just triglyceride levels in your bloodstream, but your HDL and your LDL. Now, another component to keep in mind here, and this is with long chain fatty acids, short chain fatty acids and medium chain fatty acids, they are actually going to take steps and go a little bit faster. Hadley, are you okay? Hadley, all right?
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's okay. You just drop your phone.
Yeah.
Oh, you're good. Just hoping that someone's not, getting taken out while they're listening to a very mediocre presentation. So when I was referring to, guys, those micelles breaking us down the individual fatty acids, reesterifying into triglycerides, and then being sent out as chylomicrons, okay, you can kind of see this, the image put here. Whereas notice, guys, those medium chain fatty acids, they just go straight on through. Same thing with short chain fatty acids. Okay. Now, when it comes to proteins, remember, guys, we're going to be able to get them transported again through the SIM port utilizing sodium, where now we're going to have it in basic amino acids, dipeptides, and tripeptides. And notice the liver itself is going to be the first stop once we go ahead and effectively leave there. Now, inside the cell, these dipeptides and tripeptides will be broken down into individual amino acids. And then from there, once again, sent into our circulation. And we're going to have literally 7 different specific transporters for those different amino acids. Because when we get there, you're going to see that what's known as the R group, which is what gives amino acids their individual essential effects. We've got a wide amount of variability. I mean, there's typically 20 different amino acids you can get through your diet, but the number is actually much, much higher than that when you look at how many you're going to find actually in nature. So when it comes to our vitamin absorption, for the most part, we are going to be absorbing it pretty much throughout our small intestine. The key is at what areas of it. So when we're looking up at this table, guys, and hopefully you guys can see this okay. I'll try to size that up a little bit so you guys can see a bit easier. Okay. When you're looking at this table, okay, I want you guys to tell me what stands out to you guys when it comes to our, notice these are our water-soluble vitamins. Our fat-soluble vitamins will be incorporated into those micelles, our vitamin D, K, A, and E. But what do you see as far as something that happens to be essentially a little bit special when we're looking through these different vitamins and where they're going to be or how they're going to be absorbed? No worries, Cass. So when we're looking at these vitamins, which one of them has a bit of a special property with how we're going to actually absorb it?
Isn't it vitamin B12 because it has the intrinsic factor?
Absolutely. And our body's natural production of that intrinsic factor tends to go down as we get older. Hence, you typically have a higher, slightly higher risk for B12, essentially deficiency as you get older. Not like as in pro athletes, so they don't have enough B12, so they get injections, and the injections are actually steroids. But instead, this is potentially an issue. Specifically, B vitamins 12 is one that you're going to find pretty easily in meat products. Whereas if you're happen to be a very strict vegan, vegetarian, you can potentially have an issue with not getting in enough of that. Does that make sense to you guys? Good. So I made mention earlier about the joys of bacteria and essentially how much of it we happen to have in our body. So notice, guys, this is viable bacteria per gram. So an incredibly small metric as we're going through our digestive tract. So in our stomach, it's literally from 0 to 10 to the third power, which means literally between 0 and 1,000, because we're gonna have 3 zeros. In the jejunum, it's between 0 and 10,000. And then notice, guys, when we get all the way to our colon, it's between 10 to the 10th to 10 to the 12th. So we're literally talking about literally over 1 billion getting into 1 trillion bacteria per gram in your large intestine. This is normal. This is not a bad thing. In fact, this is important because once again, it's going to help with fermenting those foods as we happen to be going through, specifically with fiber, and has positive properties specifically on our health. So when it comes to how quickly we're going to empty our foods from our diet, well, it's kind of funny. Literally just thinking about smelling food or seeing food is going to help make this work. But then the total volume, so the greater amount we're eating is actually going to speed up gastric emptying. Energy density of the meal or the drink is going to also cause it to essentially slow down because we got that higher caloric content. What's fascinating is temperature is going to affect it. Something that's very hot or cold is going to slow down the gastric emptying because our stomach is way tougher than our small intestine, irregardless of how often you guys, have a upset stomach. And obviously something like ulcers are absolutely horrible. If you can avoid them, avoid them. Now, the osmolarity of the meal is going to be important because remember, if we have a really, really high osmolarity, it's going to slow that down. Your body temperature itself and how dehydrated you are is also going to slow down that gastric emptying. And when we're exercising at a much higher intensity, because we don't have as much blood flow going to our GI, it's going to slow our gastric emptying. And typically in between genders, women, they happen to have slightly slower gastric emptying than men, more or less due to a factor of typically body size, because your average guy is bigger than your average girl. And notice stress itself is going to mess up a little bit of your digestive because we're not going to have as much parasympathetic tone as we would otherwise. So one of the things that we're going to be concerned about is thinking about GI issues specifically while we're exercising and then potentially after exercising. So it's relatively normal to hear about intestinal issues in long distance runners when they happen to be competing. And this obviously happens to be a large number of potential issues. Now, it's going to come down and be broken down into 3 major mechanisms. One, we have a situation where it's a physiological problem, meaning we don't have enough blood flow to that area. This can be due to sympathetic nervousness, or obviously we're at a high enough cardiac output that we're shunting blood away from the GI because we're sending more to the muscles and the skin. We then have the mechanical factors itself of literally the bouncing up and down, which is potentially going to cause us issues as well as a cramped posture. So you think about a cyclist in that bent over position. And then finally, we have the nutritional factors. So this is going to be putting in a lot of fiber, fat. Certain folks are going to react poorly to dairy, as well as really, really concentrated carbohydrate solutions can cause some issues. So we want to make sure that we're doing what we can to allow our athletes to be successful nutritionally. So how we're going to prevent this is, well, let's be aware of limits. So statistically speaking, what do you guys think your chances of encountering somebody that happens to be lactose intolerant? And it depends on where you're at. So it's kind of an unfair question, but Colleen, not a bad start jumping off point of think 1 in 4. Now, when you're dealing with Caucasian people, they actually have the lowest rates of incidence. When you're working with folks that are Native American, it's going to be some of the highest rates you're going to see, along with, obviously, there's going to be folks that are of African descent, of Asian Pacific Islander. They're going to typically have higher rates. So like anything else, you need to learn the athlete you're working with. Now, we want to avoid the high fiber foods specifically right before we're doing the training or the exercise, because that is going to slow us down, and make sure we time things, because last thing you want to be doing is halfway through with a marathon and concerned that you're going to have disaster pants. Now, NSAIDs as well as aspirin can have some issues on the GI tract. So we need to be mindful of athletes are trying to use these, that they're either habituated or we're not trying to add anything that they're not used to. Things that happen to have high amounts of fructose because we can overload those transporters can be problematic, as well as obviously not being well hydrated and trying anything new. If we're trying something new nutritionally, and this is their actual competition, we are really setting ourselves up to have some very, very bad outcomes. Instead, we want to focus on making sure that we're doing the things that we've seen consistency in. It tends to work. And we want to make sure that we happen to be used to that total amount of carbohydrate turnover, that they're used to having those large carbohydrate feedings, so that we're not going to be causing, once again, the aforementioned GI issues. Now, that is the key things that I wanted to go through when we talk about digestion, of how we're going from top to bottom. Obviously, I'm sure you guys have some questions, so we can go and go through that. Next week is going to be your guys' first exam. You're going to take it as an individual, and then you're going to take it as a group. So as far as the groups, since we're doing this obviously online, I'm open to any ideas you guys have of how you'd like to be parsed into said groups. And from there, we'll go ahead and do the review. So I'm going to hit pause on the record because this is going to be useful for you guys to review. Not a bad start, Catherine's group, but we're definitely missing some big components we need to add to it. Anyone have anything they want to add to it? There's a lot more going on under the hood than there. What's the other component of calories in or calories out that is not being accounted for in what Catherine's group came up with? Yes, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, absolutely. That's going to be a major modifier of how many calories that someone's going to be potentially utilizing over the day, specifically when it comes to compensatory actions that are going to occur when individuals are trying to gain or lose weight. So calories in, yeah, that's our fats, carbs, and proteins. Now, folks, when we try to gain weight, okay, what's going to naturally increase when it comes to our calories out? When we try to gain weight, what is naturally going to increase?
Is it like your thermal effective food or something like that?
Your thermal effective food is going to increase because you're taking in more calories. Absolutely. Mandy, you are correct as well. Your resting metabolic rate is going to go up because you now weigh more. What else is going to increase? Very true, because you now are heavier for how tall you are, but that's not really the component we're looking for. As you gain weight, what else is going to increase, guys? There's only 4 components of calories out. So what else is going to go up? You guys just give me a guess. It's okay. Is my sound just not coming through very well tonight? Like, is it not, you guys can't really understand me?
No, it's coming through. I think we're all just, I don't know, being quiet, I guess. So my guess, I don't know if it's already been said, but basically that as you exercise, you do lose more because you essentially weigh more. That's what I was trying to say.
Yes, you're going to be burning more calories if you're doing the same amount of exercise. Absolutely. So that's going to work against your attempts to gain weight. So Josh, the thermic effect of food is mostly coming from breaking down protein, but that's still a little bit of component of digestion of fat and carbs. I wouldn't worry about getting too granular there, but definitely understanding that the heavier body you now have literally burns more calories doing the same amount of work that you did previously, which can make it much harder to gain weight, as well as some folks who are going to really compensatorily increase their non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So that's going to further make it even harder for them to gain weight. Like some folks, if you put them in a massive caloric, do you mind giving me the acronym of what you're trying to say with that? If you spell it out as opposed to give me the acronym. Is that exercise activity thermogenesis? And that's going to be the calories you burn from exercise, which, yeah, like we just spoke of, if you're heavier, you're literally going to burn more calories doing the same amount of exercise that you were doing previously. Awesome. Yes. And so your NEAT's going to go up, your thermic effect of food goes up because you're eating more food. Your BMR goes up because you weigh more and you burn more calories at rest. And then your exercise, which we're assuming they are exercising, is naturally going to go up, as is if they're doing the same amount because they're heavier. And so can easily their NEAT because they just fidget more because they're higher energy. And all those things are going to make it harder to gain weight than one would suspect if we just had the perfect, we are in a 500 calorie surplus. Because eventually, even if you don't increase your NEAT, you don't increase your exercise activity, you've only increased your BMR and your thermic effect of food. At some point, that bulking calorie count eventually becomes your new maintenance, because you're not going to go up anymore, because your body, the resting metabolic rates come up to compensate for that difference, and you're going to stick there. Now, what's happening when we're at a caloric deficit, guys? So we're not taking in as many calories. What's going to make it harder for us to lose weight than we suspect? Yes, Colleen, absolutely. You burn less calories, but doing what? Let's get granular again, guys.
Doesn't your body like get more efficient as you go?
You have a lighter body, so the resting metabolic rate's lower because you don't need as many calories to keep it going. 2, exercise is now even lower calorically demanding because you once again have a smaller body that is a lot lighter, so you don't have to burn as many calories covering the same distance. And then obviously, if you're trying to lose that weight through decreasing your caloric intake, your thermic effect of food is lower. And some folks, when they happen to really you cut their calories a lot, they barely move at all. So how many of you guys have ever tried to do a harsh diet? So you've tried to really actively lose a solid amount of weight and found yourself feeling pretty much lethargic all the time, as well as you have a heck of a time trying to feel warm, like you feel like you're cold all the time. Yeah, so that's a pretty good indicator that your resting metabolic rate and that non-exercise activity thermogenesis are all being essentially downregulated. So notice, guys, that's a pretty involved and pretty nuanced thing. And that's going to be a big essay question for probably at least 10 points out of 100 on your exam. So make sure it's not just, well, calories in, calories out. Okay, what all goes into calories in? What all goes into calories out? How does the one influence the other? Does that make sense? Awesome. So make sure you go through, guys, RDAs, DRIs, upper level of intake, what EARs, what they all mean, okay, and how they're important. Understand the order and function of our digestive system. So understand what enzymes do what, you know, where do we start, where do we finish if we're going in the correct order. How different energy systems are going to be obviously utilizing different fuels and how long those systems are going to last for. Remember we had that group project that we had you guys name different fatty acids and their function, as well as the non-nutritive when we're talking about curcumin, resveratrol, sulforaphane, glycero or cyanidine 3 glucoside, and how those can be potentially influencing our health, and just kind of the big kind of linchpins of each of the chapters. Those are things that I want you guys to spend a little time on. Kind of give you, Josh, a little bit more kind of a heads up. That's some of the things I would definitely make sure you hit on. Are there any other questions I can help you guys with about the material, things that you struggle with, things that seem not so clear because, you know, we covered it earlier, that you want me to go ahead and go through? Okay, well, it seems like everybody is being, once again, pretty quiet. Stay safe out there, guys. Make sure you stay on top of things. We are going to be doing hopefully some form of a brief lecture, but the key is make sure you take your exam and your group exam. Was every group able to figure out a time that's going to work for everybody to, you know, link up through whatever type of streaming methodology, or maybe at the library for you guys to take the group exam? Obviously, make sure you take the individual exam before the group exam. If you take your individual exam after your group exam, I will manually go in and give you a 0 on your group exam or your individual exam. Please don't do that. But you guys all know when you're going to go and everything else. Yeah, it should be open so that effectively, Mandy, please don't take it this week. I'm going to play with it a little bit tomorrow to kind of have the final edition of it for you guys, and then essentially plan on trying to take it next week, obviously at some point. Before you have to take both versions of it before effectively what would be the end of Thursday night of next week. So, because I really don't like talking to myself and I've been doing it for too long, we're going to go in alphabetical order, and I want you guys to ask me a quick question on anything associated with the class. So I'm done recording this.